Hey everyone, welcome to this week's crypto update. So this week I'm going to be focusing on Digital Currency Group, DCG. And this is one of the biggest companies in crypto. They own Genesis, a huge institutional crypto lender. They own Grayscale, the company that oversees GBTC and ETHE, the Grayscale, Bitcoin, and Ethereum trusts, among others. They own CoinDesk, which is a pretty big crypto media company, and they own Foundry, which is the company that runs the biggest mining pool, Bitcoin mining pool in the world. So they're a pretty big deal and they are in some potential trouble. So I'm going to get into the bad first and then the good, and then look at a couple possible outcomes that we could see play out over the coming weeks or months. So this is mostly going to focus on Genesis and their ability to really survive after being hit hard by the 3AC collapse, Three Arrows Capital, and more recently the FTX collapse. So, like I said, Genesis is one of the biggest institutional crypto lending firms out there. At the end of Q1, they had about $14.5 billion in outstanding active loans. And at the end of Q3, that was all the way down to $2.8 billion. So that was partially due to 3AC going under and the related contagion to that, and partially due to the fact that there's just not that much demand for crypto right now, especially since May, June, when everything really fell very quickly related to that Luna and 3AC collapse. So more recently with FTX, it was found out that Genesis had $175 million on the platform, which they're probably not going to be able to recover because it doesn't really sound like anything is there for people that had money on FTX to ever get back. So it's a huge question mark whether they're ever going to see that $175 million again. And DCG, their parent company, actually kind of bailed them out from this. So DCG gave them a cash injection of $140 million. That was on November 11th. And then on the 17th, Genesis was already asking for another $1 billion in emergency funding. When they didn't get that, a couple days later, they actually halted withdrawals. So people that had money on Genesis cannot get it off. And that's still the case right now. And then on November 21st, they lowered their ask from $1 billion to $500 million. So they still haven't seen any takers. It's about 2 weeks out from that point. So it's really unlikely that they're really going to get that much financial assistance. And it doesn't look like DCG is very willing or even able to give them too much more money at this point. So that's definitely something to watch because a lot of the assets that Genesis has at this point are related to DCG. So they've got the $575 million that DCG owes them. And it turns out that DCG actually went out and spent all that money, or probably close to all of it, if not all of it, on buying back DCG shares from non-employee shareholders and also most likely buying shares of GBTC. So they were essentially borrowing from one part of their company and taking that money and instantly buying a product that another part of their company runs. So very, I think, poor money management in DCG's case there. And in Q3, they bought about, it looks like $450 to $500 million worth of GBTC. So if you really connect the dots there, it's pretty likely that that funding that they used to buy the shares of GBTC came from that $575 million loan. And again, they used a lot of money also to repurchase shares. So really, really bad decision making there with that money. And now Genesis is in the hole for $575 million. DCG gave them that initial $140 million, but it looks like that they're not really able to give them any more beyond that. Now, another thing that DCG did that's really questionable is they took on the liability from Genesis. Basically, to keep Genesis alive, Genesis had a $1.2 billion claim on Three Arrows Capital's assets. So it's unlikely probably that Three Arrows Capital is going to get much of that money back that they owe to creditors. And Genesis was actually the biggest creditor in the bankruptcy filing. They have claims, again, of $1.2 billion on Three Arrows Capital, but DCG actually assumed that liability for Genesis to kind of plug the hole on Genesis' balance sheet. So now for Genesis, that $1.2 billion goes from being a liability to being an asset because it's assumed that DCG is going to pay them that money in the future. And now, if Three Arrows Capital ever is able to recover that money, they would pay it to DCG, and then DCG would pay it back to Genesis. So it really didn't help Genesis that much. It really is a temporary situation or temporary solution that makes it look okay for Genesis, keeps them out of bankruptcy for now, or at least it did back then. But it looks like they're probably going to have to file for bankruptcy anyway, especially if they can't get that emergency funding. So I know that was a lot of bad news, but there is a silver lining here, and that is Grayscale. So unlike a lot of other VC companies or lenders, Grayscale actually is not even, they can't even be irresponsible with their money because that money is custodied by Coinbase. All of the underlying Bitcoin, Ethereum, and altcoins that they have their trust shares reflecting are custodied by Coinbase. So Grayscale can't touch them. Even people that own the trust shares cannot touch them because the shares are currently trading at a discount to the actual value of the underlying crypto. So Grayscale still has all of their cryptocurrency with Coinbase. Coinbase has been one of the most compliant companies out there in terms of regulations. So I have really no reason to believe that Coinbase doesn't have that money. And actually, there's been some pretty detailed on-chain sleuths going around and tracking the coins to what looks like Coinbase's custody addresses, and the coins are all there. So Grayscale really does look to be healthy. And even if Genesis and DCG go under, and this is kind of the bear case scenario where DCG can't repay the loan to Genesis, Genesis will, they probably won't ever get the Three Arrows Capital money, and they probably, at this point, it looks like they're not going to get the $500 million emergency funds, and maybe not even the $575 million loan from DCG. Because if DCG was able to help them, I feel like they would have done at least part of that $1 billion ask that Genesis was asking for. So the worst case scenario is that both these companies go under. If that happens, I think that they're just going to sell Grayscale's business and use the money from that sale to pay back creditors. Grayscale, either way, I think will be fine. Whoever buys them is probably making a very, very good deal if this does happen. And if that happens, DCG is one of the biggest owners of Grayscale Bitcoin Trust, GBTC. So they might have to sell some or all of that, assuming they go bankrupt and they have to pay back creditors. They're probably going to have to sell that GBTC. So as of the end of Q3, they owned, I think, 9.7% of the total supply. So that would be a lot of selling pressure for GBTC, not Bitcoin itself, and they wouldn't be able to sell that underlying Bitcoin because nobody can redeem it when it's trading at a discount. So GBTC might see further increases, I guess, in the discount. But I think that if this happens, the fact that Grayscale would be bought by a better financial company, a company that's in better financial shape, that would be positive enough news maybe to generate enough buying pressure to get that discount back down and get the overall price of GBTC back closer to the actual value of the underlying Bitcoin. So I could see it really going either way in that situation. Obviously, it could be painful for the short term just for GBTC, not necessarily for Bitcoin. But overall, it would be great to see Grayscale actually owned by a financially responsible company. So the bull case scenario is that DCG actually is able to scrape together the cash for Genesis in order to bail them out, and neither one of them goes under. If one of them had to go under, obviously if DCG goes down, Genesis is going with it. But if Genesis goes down, that doesn't necessarily mean that DCG goes down, in which case DCG would still own Grayscale. They would still retain ownership of their other businesses as well. And I think that would ultimately be much better for the crypto space if DCG were to stay around. Obviously, there would have to be a lot more responsibility on the financial end of their business. It wouldn't result in the massive sale of the GBTC and the revenues from Grayscale, because they charge a 2% fee on all of their holdings. So at current prices, that generates about $300 million a year for their business. So you'd think that DCG would be able to find something to possibly plug the hole a little bit for Genesis. But we will see in the coming weeks and months. So that's kind of the bear and bull case scenarios that I've outlined. I go into a little bit more detail in the Substack, so make sure you check that out as well. But that is it for this week, so thank you everybody for watching, and I will see you again on Wednesday.